Bangladesh recently made the news when the country's student movement forced the Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina to give up power and leave the country. That's the headlines, but what's behind these headlines? I read an article where our guest today, Nagesh Rao, was interviewed by David Whitehouse and Aaron Amaral in Tempest magazine at tempestmag.org. Tempest calls itself a revolutionary socialist collective. Nagesh Rao is originally from Bangalore, India. He's a professor of English who taught in the U.S. for several years before moving to Bangladesh last year. We want to thank you for facing reality for social justice as we explore the sometimes bloody dynamic that led to Sheikh Hasina's departure and the complex relationship of forces that are now looking for ways to move forward. This interview will be the first of two we did with Nagesh, with the next coming up in our next episode. After the interview, we've added a 1-minute sound excursion of people in the streets fighting for justice. Hi, Nagesh. Thank you very much for joining us today. Bangladesh has gone through quite a bit over the past couple of months, and you wrote a very interesting, you were interviewed in a very interesting article in Tempest magazine about what is going on in Bangladesh. And so I took the opportunity to get in touch with you to see if you could join us today to give us a little bit of background to see how it works out. And if people are interested, I think it's really worth their while to take a look at the article as well. It's at tempestmag.org. And I think that what we'll be talking about today, this article will give a little bit more detailed background. But before we get into some of the implications of the article and some of the things that are happening now, if you could quickly go over a little bit what the article did talk about as well, the background of what's been happening over the past couple of months, maybe since January in the elections in the country, and we can move from that into what's going on today and where things are going. If you don't mind, if you could do that.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thanks for having me on your podcast, Wayne. Your audience may or may not know the details of what's been happening. I'll just give you a brief sketch of the past 2 months, essentially, which have been incredibly. It's been like a roller coaster. I mean, we've been going up and down, and right now we're in one of those downs, but we'll come to that in just a bit. So we've gone through something that we yet don't have a name for. Some are calling it a revolution. Some are calling it a transfer of power. And I feel like, it's everything is still very much in motion. We had an uprising, which was a mass uprising that was triggered by a student-led protest against an unfair quota system that had been put in place, for a long time, but had been stopped in 2018. So there had been a student protest in 2018 against this quota system, and they had the Sheikh Hasina government, which got toppled, had stopped those quotas, and this year, for some reason, they brought them back. And the quota in particular was a quota for civil services jobs, and it reserved. There was a 30% quota for children and grandchildren of freedom fighters of the 1971 Liberation War. So Sheikh Hasina's government was, she's the party in power was the Awami League government, and Sheikh Hasina had just won. We'll just use that word for now. She hadn't really won anything, but she'd won her re-election in January in a totally rigged election, which the opposition had completely boycotted. And, the Prime Minister herself used the word the words dummy candidate, to talk about how to give the election a veneer of legitimacy because the opposition had boycotted it. She said we should put up dummy candidates. And so they did. They put up a whole bunch of dummy candidates, candidates from their own party, standing as independents, and they had an election, and she'd just been reelected. And perhaps because she was overconfident about her position, or perhaps because she wanted to provoke some kind of incident to detract from her recent trip to China that had been cut short. There's a lot of speculation on why this happened, but essentially, um, uh, this quota was reintroduced by a High Court order, and students rose up against it because 30% of jobs were reserved for people who were considered, who by now were considered very much part of the Awami League system. So this quota system had essentially become a way that the party kind of perpetuated its rule by granting these quota certificates to these freedom fighter certificates to people so that they could get jobs in this quota. So it was a system that was ridden with corruption as well.
Well, could I ask real quick on the question of the students? They are part of general. Who are the students in a sense, and what kind of universities are they going to? Are we talking about people who are usually situated fairly well in Bangladesh society, or are they just people who are trying to get a job, or exactly? How does that? What's the dynamic there?
Right. So the movement actually began on public university campuses. So Dhaka University, Jahangirnagar University, Chittagong University, a number of public campuses were involved in the protests initially, because these are students that come from all walks of life. Public university education here is inexpensive. I mean, it's virtually free. It's where students from all walks of society can get higher education, but at the same time, it's also, Dhaka University is actually pretty competitive, and so it's not easy to get into these universities. But most of the students who go to these universities, many of them, I won't say most, many of them who come from, lower middle class or working class backgrounds, they see the civil services, they aspire to civil services jobs as jobs that have, job security, etc. So the movement began there, but it really kind of exploded. It became a mass movement when Sheikh Hasina came out on TV and essentially insulted the students in a snide remark where she said, of course we're going to give these jobs to children of freedom fighters. Are you asking us to give them to the children of traitors to the nation? The term she used was Razakar. And the Razakars were basically people who sided with Pakistan, or at that time, West Pakistan, during Bangladesh's liberation war.
That's a deep insult, then, very much.
So they were sort of collaborators with a genocidal colonial regime, West Pakistani regime. So yes, it was it's a deep insult, and so that when she did that, this was on the night of July 14th. Private university students came out onto the streets in solidarity with the public university students, who had also, by then, on July 14th and 15th, they had faced a lot of violence from the Awami League's student wing called the Bangladesh Chhatra League, the student league. And we can talk about the Chhatra League in more detail, but they're basically goons who beat up these protesters. And so when private university students came out in solidarity with the public university students. This was on July 15th, July 16th. This thing became really big, and then on the 16th, the first student, Dhaka University student, uh, was became a martyr for this movement. His name was Abu Saeed. He was murdered. He was killed at point blank range. I mean, the videos are on YouTube. People have, the video went viral. And he was killed point blank by police during the protest with his arms spread wide, holding nothing but a stick in his hand, kind of baring his chest and saying, "Shoot me!" And they shot him. Not once, they shot him twice or thrice, and until he collapses, and that video just spread like crazy. And then you had the whole thing by the 17th. The thing had become truly a mass movement.
No, when you say mass movement, you're talking more than just a student movement, or you're saying within society?
No, I mean a mass student movement.
Okay.
So all the private university students came out, and then on the 17th, then the violence escalated. So the goons and the police escalated their violence through the 17th, 18th, and 19th, and that violence from the police then triggered a whole-scale mass uprising.
Okay.
Where I was on the streets, like during one of the protests, just sort of in my neighborhood. I mean, it was basically everything had come to a standstill, and you just walk out onto the streets, and there's a protest there. And I saw how when police came into sight, regular people who were just drivers and hawkers and so on, who were just standing around watching the protests. The moment they saw police in sight, they would immediately band together, pick up rocks, pick up stones, pick up sticks, start hurling them at the cops. The sheer rage that you felt on the streets among people against the police and against the police state. So this became really an explosion of anger against the repressive arms of the state, against the police. This was very clearly, that's what it became. So ordinary people, working class people, just came out onto the streets with the students, and you had, before you knew it, by the 19th evening, the government cut off broadband internet. They imposed curfew, and everything went up, and we were pretty much a communications blackout. We had access to some, we could do text messaging, and if you had cable TV, you could watch the news, but the news wasn't showing anything.
Right.
And most people don't, who has cable TV, so so at that point, after that, all we heard was battles on the street, like gunfire, tear gas shells, sound grenade after sound grenade, helicopters, just gunfire all night long, all day long, for days after.
Fairly soon after that, I didn't want to move us along a bit. Sheikh Hasina, she left the country, and obviously there's a vacuum then on what happens. And
August 5th,
yes.
Yeah.
And then somebody's going to fill the vacuum. I mean, vacuums don't last very long. And could you start to take us into what happened there with the new government, and how are things looking now? How do people feel about the ups and the downs, as you put it at the beginning, for what's going on with what the opportunities are, what the possibilities are?
So, I think we have to say that the immediate aftermath of Sheikh Hasina's departure, she fled, as she was, whisked away in an army helicopter. The immediate aftermath was just sort of the sense of euphoria. an autocrat had fallen and had fallen to the power of mass resistance on the streets. At that point, we had no numbers, no clear numbers, but about 300 or 400 officially had been killed at that point. Uh, but the numbers were much higher. 10,000 or so were being had been injured, according to the press. That was just official estimates. So the fact that she fled, the fact that the government fell, was experienced as this moment of euphoria on the streets and everywhere. And the next few days, we spent nearly 3 days and 4 nights with no government. And we spent about 7, 8 days, with no police at all in sight. And that actually, in fact, the lack of police continues to this day. So the police force has been so discredited and so, it's just so discredited and so hated. And the fact that the police force were drawn from the same kind of milieu of the student league, the Bangladesh Chhatro League. You became a goon for the ruling party, and then you joined the police. These had, those didn't have uniforms. These have uniforms. And so the police were not have been unwilling to come back. Also because their ability to extort has gone, their ability to take bribes has gone. So to this day, that remains the case, that there's a lack of police on the streets.
Right. What's the relationship between, if there is a relationship between the police and the military force, the army? I mean, every time there's a vacuum in government, one question comes up fairly quickly: is the role of the army in any situation? Mm-hmm. I know in Bangladesh that's a touch more complicated, maybe in some other places, given what the new sort of administration is trying to organize things in the country. But is there an organizational relationship or a political relationship between the thugs of the police and the leadership of the army? I guess you could put it from that point of view.
I'm not sure. I don't think so. I don't think organizationally they are linked. I think they're separate. It has had a military. It has had military rule in the past.
Right.
Right. So it's had military rule. It's had coups. So coups and counter coups. So people have a memory of being ruled by the army. So here's what happened in those days when there was a vacuum. The students pivoted from toppling a dictator to cleaning up the streets, to organizing traffic, to preventing price gouging in the markets, to a whole host of things of civic life began to be organized by students themselves. Neighborhood watches. In my neighborhood, people, led by students, ordinary people organize themselves into groups, and these, some tech savvy students using drones and stuff like that, doing safety patrolling at night. Students and ordinary people took over the kind of running of society, if you will, for like 3 days, 4 days, and safety stuff was handled by students. Safety issues was handled by students for like 7, 8 days running. So I wanted to bring up all this to talk about that vacuum and to say that the students initially were approached by the army chief, and the reports we heard was that the students refused to meet with the army chief, and they insisted that they would meet only with the president, in keeping with the constitution, and they didn't want the army. They didn't want to hand over power to the army. And it was the students who insisted, who named Yunus as the chief advisor for the interim government.
Right.
So Professor Yunus was their choice. And it appears that they chose him partly because he's the name that they recognized most readily, partly because and that's because he is a well respected and well loved figure in Bangladeshi public life, and he's well known for his persecution at the hands of the Awami League. That's how. So he came in to fill that vacuum with the support of the army. It needs to be said.
Right.
So this is a complicated thing. The students didn't give the army the direct control of anything, but it's clear that the army is in control of the repressive arm of the state. And now recently, because of the police not being willing to come back, the army has been given law and order policing duties and been given powers of magistracy. I don't know how you pronounce that,
Right.
but that is that they can actually pursue crime. They can actually go and do policing essentially. So it's a complicated sort of dynamic here.
And so, to some extent, from it seems to be what you're saying, is that the army is assuming some of the role of the less well organized thugs in the police force, which in some situations, some people would say, "Hey, that's a better situation because we don't have the police force as they were on top of us." At the same time, it obviously gives the political role of the army and what's going on. But when you say about students, obviously they're how are they organized? I mean, you can't have this kind of political participation in government and on the streets unless there's some kind of organization someplace. A lot of it could be neighborhood. Well, it could also be national. I was just wondering, how are students organized within the political process that they can sort of say who can and who can't be the chief advisor, for instance?
Well, so the student movement, now there are two elements to this. On the one hand, student politics in public universities in Bangladesh, student politics have been very politicized. Campuses are politicized spaces, and this is true in South Asia as a whole, where political parties have their student wings. So student politics is really around, and so when Awami League was in power, their student wing ruled the campuses. They dominated the campuses through thuggery and so on.
Right.
But other student wings, other student party groups existed affiliated to other political parties. So they're organized that way. But so on the one hand, but the student movement itself, the anti-quota movement, or what actually not anti-quota, the term is the anti-discrimination movement, student anti-discrimination movement. Its leadership consisted of about 60 or so coordinators from different campuses. These student coordinators actually are not currently students. They are student leaders, but they are former students. They're students who graduated perhaps, I don't know, maybe a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. And so they're student leaders who, and they emerged as leaders of the uprising because they were the leadership of this anti-discrimination movement that triggered the uprising. And during the uprising, during the curfew, they had to go underground. And they faced a lot of persecution and at the hands of the police and so on. And so they emerged after Hasina fled. They emerged into the open as heroes. They were welcomed as heroes, and two of them.
Were they chosen by a student assembly of some sort, or were they just not natural leaders, but leaders who developed over the fighting over the past number of months as well?
Yeah, they're leaders who've clearly emerged in the course of the uprising, emerged in the course of the anti-discrimination movement, but not not in any way accountable to the student body in any sort of formal way.
Okay.
So even before the uprising, when the protests were going on, there were students who were complaining that the leaders weren't accessible or weren't listening to them, and so on. So the way the decisions were made by the student leaders and so on was kind of very opaque. You couldn't really get a clear. It wasn't transparent necessarily, even to students. So this is a kind of leadership, a kind of de facto leadership that emerged out of the uprising. They were not put there by the students necessarily.
Are they recognized by the students? I mean, if
Yeah.
leadership
But
develops on its own.
recognized,
Yes.
yes.
So that's leadership coming out of the fight, which is different than necessarily being
Recognized.
elected. Yeah.
That's right. Recognized and widely respected, and kind of given hero status. That's part of the problem. Like, I mean, we don't, the kind of hero worship, uh, uh, yeah, can be a problem sometimes.
So one of the things what you're looking at here then is this new, I won't say the new administration, at least you call it the administration of government under Yunus. And at the same time, this administrative body, this advisor group, has two students, a number of people from the Army, and others that are part of this coalition, I guess you could say, as well. And I assume also there's a lot of instability in that coalition in the sense of how
it's a panel. So it's a panel of advisors. This is a government. I would characterize it as like a neoliberal government of civil society and former ex-military. They're not serving military. Ex-military bureaucrat types. Some technocrats and some civil society folks. Politically, I would call it a kind of that it's a mixed bag. There are some liberals there are some well-known rights activists there are some right-wing politically right-wing forces there. So it's a mixed bag, the government, and it's headed by, of course, Yunus, who's a neoliberal banker.
Okay, well, that complicates what you have then. Just to take a little bit of a broader view here, was a massive upsurge, starting with students, but supported by a part, at least, of the population, enough to get the prime minister not only to end her position, but also to leave the country. I mean, it's quite a big deal. At the same time, it's a coalition of very different kind of political people. It would be interesting to see how they talk when they get into these meetings, because there must be hostility all over the place.
Well, the task the interim government has, the task they have. See, Bangladesh's politics have been kind of stuck in a bipolar, a polarized thing between the Awami League, which which sees itself which saw itself as the legatee of the 1971 Liberation War, because they're the party that sort of led that war and came out victorious, and the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, the BNP, which is sort of a conservative. So Awami League was kind of liberal, let's say, or it had a liberal veneer. And then you have the BNP, which is sort of conservative, and with ties to the Islamic parties and organizations and so on. And because of the very fragile democracy that's existed here, Bangladesh has devolved a system which had worked in the past of transition from one elected government to the other being facilitated through a neutral caretaker government. So when it was time for elections, the government would sort of hand over power to a caretaker government, the caretaker government would conduct the elections. This and so now the Awami League government made a change in the constitution that got rid of the clause that allowed for a caretaker government. And they said, no caretaker governments, we're just going to do the elections. And the opposition said, well, then we're going to boycott the elections because we don't trust that you. And so the last, 2-3 elections have been boycotted by the opposition. So these are all elections where, Awami League was essentially elected pretty much unopposed, it and its allies. And many on the left, or a lot of left parties allied with the Awami League, in the course of these few years as well, disgracefully enough, and that's a whole different story. But so the interim government's job what is essentially to carry this thing through, at least in many people's eyes, to carry this process through to a point where you can have free and fair elections. The problem is the Constitution itself has many sort of poses some obstacles in the way of having free and fair elections, because the previous regime manipulated things and rewrote things and used loopholes in the Constitution to remain in power. If there are elections again with that same under that same framework, people are scared that the BNP will now come back and do exactly what the Awami League did.
Okay.
Because the BNP doesn't have that greater historical track record either. When they were in power, they were just as autocratic, they were just as ruthless, etc., etc. So people don't want to see a return to that. And so they want to see a democratization of society. And the interim government is sort of tasked with that job of figuring out how to democratize society. But that lofty job is coming up against the sort of nitty-gritty day-to-day job of actually running society, where, there are all sorts of things that prevent you from moving forward on the larger democratic reforms that are needed.
Right. Wow. Okay. So that's a very complicated situation. And what I'd like to do, if we could, is just start to talk about how people in Bangladesh society and the different organizations that we're talking about. I mean, when you're talking about politics, you're talking about the development of a direction in the future. You're talking about organizational responsibilities, be it left wing, right wing, the army. People have their own interests, and those interests often conflict. And if we could start to look a little bit at what that all means for the future of what's going to be going on with politics and with the development of democracy in Bangladesh, that would be particularly good. Justice is an international cry heard from Gaza, from Sudan, and I guess from Chicago and Detroit these days. And I want to thank you for joining us today in conversation with Nagesh Rao. The music I used in Under the People in the Streets was pulled together by me, and I'm Wayne Heimbach.